It's my pleasure to introduce this morning Father Anthony Ruff, Associate Professor of Theology at St. John's School of Theology and Ministry in Collegeville, Minnesota. Father Ruff is a musician of the highest order, an organist, a composer, and a musicologist, who remains grounded in the theological vision of the Church. His book, Sacred Music and Liturgical Reform, Treasures and Transformations, is a definitive theological and historical examination of the reforms of music after the Council and is available for purchase outside. His recent recordings, Mary and Her Son, which I keep on my desk at all times, are the kind of spiritual ear candy to delight in. As the editor of Pray Tell blog, Father Ruff is a bridge figure who cannot be pinned down in the liturgical wars that so often vacillate in the United States. He's a careful observer of liturgical culture, of strategy, and someone that I trust as a confidant when we're making our own decisions at the center. He'll be with us today to speak on what does church music have to do with my life, liturgy and the new evangelization.
Good morning. Good morning. And thank you, Tim. I thought there were two special gifts at morning prayer today. One of them was the canticle, which happened to be Isaiah, which also happened to be the canticle at morning prayer the day I was clothed in the habit, and has that line about, I will be clothed in the robe of salvation. So that was a great gift for me. That was the first gift. The second one was that at morning prayer here, you can drink coffee during it. We can't do that at the monastery. Although American monasteries used to have this is long ago, a spittoon by each choir stall. Did you know that? We'll talk more about connecting liturgy to life in the course of our talk. I've been impressed by the tone of this conference because it's a very challenging topic that we're dealing with, liturgy and the new evangelization. The term new evangelization, as I'm sure you know, arose because of the problem of a loss of faith in historically Catholic countries and among the Catholic faithful. And we have seen, I'm sure you read the blogs and you see all the figures in the sociological studies of young people and the loss of church engagement. But in this conference, I've been impressed that the tone has been positive and hopeful and encouraging. That will now change. I teach grad students, but also undergrads at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. The students are mostly Roman Catholic, but increasing numbers of non-Catholics and of unchurched people. And like I'm sure here at Notre Dame and at every Catholic university, more of the young people who are coming from Catholic or mainline Protestant backgrounds are not churchgoers. And at the beginning of the semester, I invite the students to write an essay about their relationship to organized religion and worship, or I leave them the freedom. If you don't wish to share about yourself, you can talk about where you think young people are at today, or you can talk about your friends and your peers. And I, like others, have noticed a marked shift even in the last 5 years, where the default seems to be that organized religion is a force not for good. Organized religion is on the wrong side of the culture wars. Representatives of organized religion are hypocrites, hurtful, and unloving, and that the rituals of the church, this is a quote, are meaningless. And the people who engage in these rituals are just going through the motions. great skepticism about the Mass because it's so structured, and inherited structure is meaningless. It's not where I'm at. And an increasing criticism around, I have the students go to liturgies. They have to attend a Catholic and a non-Catholic liturgy and write a reflection on it. At the Catholic Mass, the one guy who dresses differently and stands on a higher level, he just reads a lot of it. And why should he get to do it all? So you see that the default relationship to authority is a troubled relationship. I'm sure you have seen all of this in your setting, among your own family and friends and relatives. Within this context, I have to say I do find that the students are also surprisingly curious and open. And I'm not just saying that because I had to try to find something positive to say. I do find that the students are searching for meaning, and they are intrigued by this new idea that organized religion actually would be meaningful. And by this, to them, it's a new idea that the rituals of the church actually do have to do with your life and with your deepest concerns. And I'm not the only one who has noticed that the openness and the curiosity seems to have increased as the students have, many of them, moved further away from the practice of faith. But it's news to students that liturgy is a participation in salvation history. It is news to them that in the liturgical rites, each person participates in the saving activity of God. That liturgical prayer is a participation in the unfolding narrative of salvation. That's a stunning claim to them. This is, I believe, a catechetical crisis. Why is this new and news to them? These are products of religious education. Many of them are products of 12 years of Catholic education or 8 years of Catholic education. Why has the catechetical work of the church not impressed upon students that the rites are saving in a way that is not just theoretical but existential? Why have we not taught this to our people? I like to ask the students, this is after I've dragged them through the history and the theory and the theology, and we've read, Barry Hudak and other people on the Eucharistic prayer. We read the general instruction, and students are surprised to hear that the Holy Spirit acts in the Eucharistic prayer. They're surprised to hear that this is building up the church. They're surprised to hear that there are all these different parts to the Eucharistic prayer. This is a challenge to our catechesis, but I think it's also a challenge to the way that we celebrate the rites. And I don't know what the answer to this is, because you can't have any wacky or loopy or forbidden solutions to it. But it is a problem to have one authority figure drone on and just read a text, blah, 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 when its meaning is so explosive, but that is not what is landing with our people. So after we do all of this, I like to ask the students, so what happens in a Eucharistic prayer? And of course, some of them are very able to recount that there's an anamnesis and there's an epiclesis and all of the rest. But then I like to say, could you answer the question in one word? If you were to pick one word of what happens in a Eucharistic prayer, and they can faith or redemption or salvation. I like to say, I think a good answer would be everything. Everything happens in a Eucharistic prayer. Creation, Exodus, Passover, promise, fulfillment, incarnation, sending of the Spirit, communion with the saints, all of it happens in a Eucharistic prayer. I have found it helpful in my work with young people to use this particular book, Christian Symbol and Ritual by Bernard Cook and Gary Macy. And this is a new move for me. I actually put up a post at Pray Tell asking for input. What texts do people use with undergrads? Because I had noticed over the past 5 or 10 years that my content, which is kind of starting with my beliefs and my values and my general instruction and my readings, seemed to interest students less. They seemed to be more and more too busy for church and uninterested in church. And so somebody suggested this text, and I don't like to use these terms because the labels are not accurate, but sometimes there's some truth in them. It's the kind of text I would not have used in the past because it's kind of coming from the left and starting from below. It all starts with human experience and the real world. And earlier in my life, I have been fearful of too much prioritizing of experience because I feel that this will water everything down. And how will we maintain the integrity of our faith and the truths of Revelation if wherever you're at is okay? I've shifted because I have found that the response is so positive when you do start with the experience of students. And although I'm not sure if Karl Rahner is mentioned in the book, he's sort of in the background of every single page. This is a quite Rahnerian book, and the authors talk about the 5 aspects of ritual. And they say the first one is that ritual is meant to help us to, let's just say, interpret. I don't know if to hermeneut, I don't think that's a verb, but ritual is to give us a worldview. It's to give us a way to be able to interpret our entire lives. It is to help us to mature. It is about presence, and here they don't even say the presence of the saving Christ. I suppose that would be too Baltazarian and too much content for now. They just say presence, but they make it clear as they describe it that it is the presence of God. Service, and that includes social justice. And the rituals of the church are about friendship. Friendship with God, friendship with each other. So I've moved toward this approach. I also do critique it so that the students, I hope, are getting more than one viewpoint. I say to them, for my piety, it's a little bit too mushy. I mean, friendship, that's so nice. Why don't we say relationship? I'm not friends with the whole parish. I'm certainly not friends with the whole monastery. I love all of them. But, it seems to me relationship would be a more accurate word, but I also can see how that's for a more abstract word. So they really start with that very concrete relational language. You've heard of these 2 theologians, Rahner and Balthasar. 2 very complex thinkers, highly nuanced. I am now going to generalize irresponsibly about each of them. There's, of course, lots of overlap in their theology and a common Catholic faith, but the insight of Karl Rahner that God is present in all experience, that in every human experience, in every act of knowing or experiencing, even before we reflect on it, and even before we thematize what's contained in that experience, there's always an openness to transcendence. Always, always, always. This Rahnerian worldview arose as, I believe, a diagnosis with the problem in Europe, in Germany where he was, that the life of faith and of grace was not a part of people's lives. Even the churchgoers who believed in it and said, I want the sacraments and I want to give grace. For them, grace was a concept. Grace was something in a bank account that said I'm okay with God, but it was not connected up with my life. So he, talked about the 4 griff. Some of you have heard about all of that. But his key insight is that all experience always, always, always is open to God. And, he used complicated continental philosophy, but it's really a receiving and rereading of Thomas Aquinas and of this scholastic axiom that grace builds upon nature. Von Balthasar, by contrast, said, he started from above. I feel bad sort of oversimplifying it by that, but he really did believe that there is a beauty about revelation, and it is a beauty that simply overcomes the soul, and the soul responds to it in the way that we aesthetically perceive something beautiful. So he has what I would call an aesthetic epistemology. As I understand von Balthasar, aesthetic for him is not about art, and it's not about culture, although he was certainly a very highly cultured and highly literate man. It's a claim about what it's like to receive revelation. It's acknowledging the beauty of it, perceiving and knowing it. This book by Karen Kilby, it's a very critical introduction. She makes the claim that the problem is with that approach could be that our proclaiming of the great mystery of salvation, our proclaiming of the message, that picture is the best book cover picture I've ever seen. It really can be kind of an old Motorola with a megaphone. It's beautiful, it's archaic, but it's kind of a museum piece, and I'm just asserting all of this ancient beauty. So it's really too much assertion from above that doesn't necessarily connect up with experience. So the shift that I have made in my teaching, maybe I'm going soft. Maybe there'll be another phase, in another 5 years. But I've come to believe that for the new evangelization, some form of a Rahnerian worldview is more helpful. And I've come to believe that some of the Balthasarian forces in the church that say we have to preserve Catholic identity, for example, runs the risk of not speaking to most people, but speaking to a small group of zealots who are seeking for something that's kind of exceptional to, and then it gets sectarian, to an overly evil modern world. I don't know if I can blame von Balthasar for this. We're talking about how it can play out in the life of the church, that this assertion of Catholic tradition and Catholic identity can be an attraction for the exceptional zealots rather than something meaningful for the whole church. And I'm sure ultimately we probably want to, synthesize these two approaches, and there's truth in all of them. But I am going to suggest that a Rahnerian starting point might be more helpful. Now, maybe once we have them in the fold, and even though that even is an authoritarian way of putting it, like it's me bringing them in, but maybe within the household of faith, we can be more Balthasarian, and we can use the traditions and symbols and rituals of the church in a more intense way. I mean, wearing the habit is Balthasarian, I would say. I still wear the habit when I teach undergrads, but you see how it's a theological issue that has to do with our account of how church relates to culture. It has to do with our view of what evangelization is about. There's a danger that it would be kind of, at its worst, a Balthasarian irrelevance, that Christianity is something irrelevant, outdated, archaic, and weird. But I hope that there's enough of a Catholic culture that it does have meaning and that it does witness to something deeper that does build upon where the students are at. I thought with this crowd it'd be okay. But you see how it is a reading, which is always provisional and subjective. It is a reading of how we think church relates to culture and how we think grace is active among us. Another book that I use with my undergrads, it's another one that was recommended on the discussion at Pray Tell, is this book on Eucharistic theology, A Banqueter's Guide to the All-Night Soup Kitchen of the Kingdom of God. And the author, Pat McCormick, really rings brings the changes on how the ministry of Jesus, his practice of hanging out with sinners, his practice of dining with outcasts, should inform our understanding of what Eucharist means for the life of the world. And in the 4 brief chapters in the book, and I think it's over 10 years old, so it would be good if he could update all of the data, but he talks about current issues like body image, and what does our culture and the advertising industry say about body image? And he treats very real issues like overeating and anorexia and body image. And then he talks about how the church is the body of Christ. What does the Eucharist bring to that? Students are quite interested in social issues, and this book has proven to be very popular because it does relate, all that religion stuff, to real life issues. And after we've read the book, I like to ask the students, so, was there any spirituality in this book? And do you know what they say? Well, no, it was about social issues. It was about politics. Yeah, it was about Jesus, but not in a spiritual way. It was about Jesus speaking about social issues. So you see what spirituality means for them. Then I say, do you think the author has a spirituality? And then they're a little challenged. Well, yeah, I suppose he does. Do you think he had spiritual and religious values that made him want to write the book? And eventually where the discussion goes is, this is what spirituality is. Spirituality is not just my relationship with Jesus, which of course is a good thing. It's not just my loving trust in Jesus, which is very appealing to a fourth or a third of you, but seems sort of irrelevant to probably most of you. No, spirituality is about our whole worldview, not just how I live my life, but how all of human life, and all of society, and all of culture is to be transformed by Christ. Now, my topic today is music. So I think we can take everything that I've said, and what I hope to do is to apply that to music and to ask questions about how music is meaningful, how music is about spirituality. Does the music of the church relate to my life? Does it relate to my maturation and my hermeneutic interpretation of my experience? Does it relate to my friendships? And all of the skepticism that we see about ritual and organized religion, I think we also see about the music of the liturgy. Although, depending on their taste, some of the students, if they're music majors or whatever, would say, well, I like the Palestrina and I like choral music in church. Others would say, I like the music when it's very contemporary and I like the praise and worship style of music. Not all of them, though. Not all of them. And when I play different examples of music, different styles of ritual, even those who are not so church-going will sometimes say, well, if I were to be a church-goer, I'm not sure I would want that contemporary music that just sounds like what I can get somewhere else. So there's an ambiguity about it that I think is helpful. But still, there's a skepticism. Well, it's the same holy, holy, holy every Sunday. What does that have to do with service or friendship or maturation? It's the same Lamb of God. It's a lot of authoritarian ritual that does not connect up. So I want to talk about how we can make the connection and how music can be, music in the liturgy can be something that does relate to my life and does have to do with how I am formed and how my life is meaningful. That is the task. How can we see that church music has anything to do with our lives? And what I'd like to propose is that we need not just a piety, but we need a real piety, a realistic piety, around the texts that we sing in the liturgy. And I think piety can be a dangerous word. It sounds kind of sentimental or churchy or whatnot. So I think we have to talk about a piety that is real and is realistic. But the texts certainly invite it. Be merciful, for we have sinned. You know, do we ever have experiences that I have sinned? Do we ever ask for mercy? Do you ever walk through the dark valley and still trust that the presence of God is with us? Do you long for justice? Do the texts of the liturgy connect up with those longings? This is a book that I like, Poems of Grace. It's a collection of all of the texts of the 1982 Episcopal hymnal, which is one of the hymnals we have in the choir stalls at the Abbey. We selected it 25 years ago because it's a lot of great, classical English language beauty in those Episcopalian texts. This is meant to be a prayer book, because the danger, I think, for me as a musician is that, I'll admit it, when we sing a hymn in the Abbey, I'm thinking about the harmony, and I'm thinking about how I would reharmonize it, how I would accompany it, and where the alto line is going, and all of that. Having this book at my bedside helps me to use the texts as a means of prayer. I think we need more of that kind of piety. And it's not just about congregational music. When the choir sings, like the deer that longs for running streams, can we all hear that and connect it to our longing in the deepest sense for running streams, our longing for refreshment? But I think we have to be realistic about it and not, monkish. The goal in all of this is not to give the impression to people that, this is what you should be more like. You lay people are secular and you have to become more churchy. See, the diagnosis of Karl Rahner was that the notion of how nature and grace relate to each other, not in Thomas himself, but in the later tradition, and especially in the 19th century retrieval of Thomas, he felt that the whole thing had become that grace was epiphenomenological. That grace was an epiphenomenon. It was kind of a second story up here. Here's nature down here, here's grace up there. And he said, no, grace for Thomas, and reread through continental philosophy, grace is in every experience. Grace is not an add-on up here. So the life of faith is not leaving the real world, escaping into this other world. It's not about being more churchy. It's about being fully alive with the faith in every moment of our life. So I think the realistic piety that I'm proposing has to be very honest, not epiphenomenological. The reason I'm using this term is because it has 9 syllables, and I wanted to be the presenter that uses a word with 9 syllables, epiphenomenological. That was one of my goals. The other goal was to see if I could talk for an hour about new evangelization without mentioning Pope Francis. Because the question is asked, is it possible in progressive Catholic circles to give a homily without quoting Pope Francis? Not where I come from. So we'll see how I do. Paul Tillich said something that I did not include in my notes, very profound, about faith and doubt. And I don't remember what the quote is, but it was something like, doubt is not the opposite of faith. Doubt is a part of faith. So it seems to me choir directors and music directors and teachers and catechists do not want to, in a sort of faux Balthasarian sense, and this is a misuse of the great von Balthasar, we don't want to act like I'm proclaiming everything and I believe all of it and I never doubt it and I'm a model and you should do the same. Rather, I think it's good to be honest about our own doubts, and I will say to students, there are times when I wonder if God exists. I wonder, as we heard in the reflection this morning, whether God is doing anything about the evil in the world. Many years ago in a course eval, one student wrote that Father Anthony is too Benedictine. And I thought, well, good, I want to be. But I think I must have been too epiphenomenological in a way, you know? And so actually this spring, one student wrote that Father Anthony talks to us like a real person. That made my day. That made my day, because I think this is sort of a Rahnerian credibility that I think we need, and that, you know, of course I don't always have, but when one student thought so once, that's a good thing. So I don't think we just want to be pious in kind of a sloppy, churchy way. Like sometimes people will say, well, the role of the choir is really about more prayer than music, so the choir should pray more than it rehearses when it gets together. Actually, I don't think that's right. I think the choir should sing in tune and learn their notes. And I think they came to sing, and I think we should let them do their work. So I don't think we have to put, you know, a layer of, you know, lace and holy water over everything to make it more pious. I even think that we have to respect the artistic and aesthetic impulse and personality, that, you know, the artistic personality with all of its problems and challenges and whatnot. This is not a model for cantors, but it is an image of, you know, the prima donna that's probably in every organist and cantor at some level. You know, I think we have to respect that, and I think some people are maybe more drawn to your choir for the musical than for the spiritual, and they may be believers and churchgoers, but I think we should just respect the musical impulse and not overdo it with being real churchy. Do musicians have to be believers and ministers? This is what the U.S. bishop said in 2007. And at some level, this is true, but I think believers are also doubters, and I think disciples are also people who are skeptical and have their own issues and problems with, is Christianity true? Are the leaders of organized religion credible witnesses? So I think it is good for choir directors and ministers to be very honest about our doubts, but then in a real way giving witness. But I don't think we should give long homilies and preach at people. But I would like to suggest that perhaps even in brief comments as an aside, you know, as you're rehearsing the choir and you're singing a text and you're just working on getting the harmonies correct and you want the interpretation, it has to build to the crescendo, and even you are there. And then just as the choir gets it, you say, isn't that great? That experience that God is there and all the problems of life after Orlando and everything else. That's why altos, you have to do what you just did right there and then just go right back to the music. So just very occasionally, every, you know, so often giving witness that this means something to me. These texts are meaningful, but not overdoing it. I think this is, do you see how this is more of a Rahnerian than a Balthasarian approach, as I'm sort of dividing that up? So you see that I am critical of overly Balthasarian, overly traditionalist accounts of Christianity, liturgy, and music, where it is an epiphenomenon that is overly sectarian and cut off from the real world. So what do we do then with the riches of our tradition? You know, I specialize in Gregorian chant. The CD that Tim mentioned, in order to increase sales, he just gave you the title but didn't say it's all in Latin. It's all Gregorian chant. You know, that's my shtick. I certainly have a great love for Latin chant and for the whole tradition of the church. Sicut Cervus, that great choral piece by Palestrina that the National Catholic Youth Choir Camp is now going on, and that's one of the pieces that they're singing this year. But I do want to say about how appropriately to use tradition, because I think within the so-called liturgy wars, the church is quite factionalized. And my diagnosis, maybe I'm overstating it, and maybe the situation looks different for you, but my diagnosis is that some of the idealism of some people, including young people in the church, is theologically problematic because it is traditionalist in a way that runs the risk of going back to an epiphenomenological Balthasarianism. So I want to talk about how we would appropriately use the treasury of sacred music, that line from Article 112 of the Liturgy Constitution, the Thesaurus Musicae Sacrae. Do you see the font that I chose for it? Not only is that bad taste, it's actually, you see this in worship leaflets sometime, and okay, you can all think I'm too influenced by the Breuer Concrete Church of St. John's Abbey, so I think everything should be just, square lines out of metal and concrete. So maybe I'm too far in the other direction, but I think this is actually a theological problem, to be drawn to a font like that. I really think this way. You think I'm mocking myself? Maybe I am. Maybe I should do that. But no, I think it's aesthetically epiphenomenological. So I think that when we are teaching and working with, it's not only young people, it's not only young clergy, but people who are drawn to the extraordinary form of the Mass, or drawn to this whole worldview they can find on the web about the hermeneutic of continuity and the reform of the reform and all the rest. I think we have to respect the idealism behind it and respect the strong feelings and the strong meaning that people are finding in it. And I hope that what I say today is not increasing the division in our church. I will say some sharp things at the level of diagnosis, but I have to remind myself, and I don't always succeed at this in what I write at Pray Tell or in my teaching, but I have to remind myself that this traditionalism, when I think it's bad and unhelpful, it actually arises from a diagnosis that something in organized religion is not working. And there's something correct about that. The Reformed liturgy is not speaking to people. It is not connecting up with their life. It's not connecting up with their experience. And so the misdiagnosis, I think, is that we can make it better by going back to what we had before. And that is somehow deeper and more meaningful and more Catholic. And so we have, in the world of church music today, a whole reform of the reform agenda. And there are many aspects to this agenda. And what's unfortunate in such a divided church is these issues here become markers, and it becomes a whole ideology, so that hymns are bad because they're Protestant and post-Vatican II and too ecumenical, and we need mass propers. Idealization of chant as if chant will solve everything. The more chant, the more Catholic and the more meaningful it will be. And a stylistic Eurocentrism with an unbelievable naivete about culture. Culture is completely ignored. The fact that people come from a culture, live in a culture, that there is a cultural context, but a tendency to blast away with ideals without even raising the question of the culture that people come from. So I think we have to channel all of this and redirect it, especially to redirect it around the Reformed liturgy, and to make the point that the Reformed liturgy in the mind of the church is more Catholic. And, to say the old liturgy raised up lots of saints and somehow people heard the gospel in it, and we don't, trash it or anything like that. But in the mind of the church, it's less Catholic. I think we have to be able to say that. And we have to be able to say that because the idealism would say, well, everything older had a stronger identity, it was more Catholic. No, the new Mass is still a sacrifice, but more so and in a deeper way. The new Mass still is the real presence of Christ, but in a deeper and in a more Catholic way. So I have to say I agree with Robert Taft. I asked him in an interview at Pray Tell whether anything good came out of Summorum Pontificum. Do you know Robert Taft? Yeah, he has a few opinions. Okay, I'm going to go on. So, if you go to the blog, you'll find what's in the 3 dots that I left out. So I had to even soften it. The problem that I see, a tendency in the reform of the reform, is to start with musical tradition and then sometimes fit it into the liturgy. So Latin chant and Palestrina is objectively good. How can we preserve that? Does the new liturgy get in the way? How can we find loopholes? How can we reinterpret it? How can we redo it so that more of my good traditional music will fit? That's what I think of that. I think it's backward. I think we have to start with liturgy and then work from there to musical tradition. And I think musical tradition it's used because it fits the purpose and the structure and the nature of the liturgy. This is my reading of Article 112 of the Liturgy Constitution, that music is an integral part of the solemn liturgy. So I want to critique this book, which is an example of the tendency I'm talking about. Elkowen Reed edited this companion to liturgy. It's an odd book, has a few treasures in it, and a lot of, I would say, odd and problematic, and even theologically, I think, uninformed and just simply wrong things in it. Wrong. In the affirmed nice sense. So there's a chapter in there on liturgical music, and I want to critique it because I think it shows some of the tendencies at work in the church that we have to deal with. First off, I think it's quite a feat for this author to write about liturgical music for 23 pages without ever treating congregational singing as something positive and integral to the liturgy. That's quite a feat, but he did it. He speaks of, quote, the principles established by the Church since the Second Vatican Council to ensure the Catholic character and identity of the liturgy. I don't think the Liturgy Constitution is about ensuring the Catholic character and identity. I think that's the author's issue in his diagnosis of everything that's gone wrong in the church. So he's going to try to proof text how we can make it more Catholic and a stronger identity. The Constitution rather talks about the liturgy as God's saving action in which we participate. And if we get all of that right, that's what the Catholic identity is. The author writes that the documents on the first phase of the reform are ambiguous on the point of preserving the received musical patrimony. Yes, they are ambiguous, and for a reason. He says, the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy supported the continued use of Latin and gave a position of privilege to Gregorian chant. At the same time, it strongly encouraged the active participation of the faithful. I think that's actually getting it backward, to say they affirmed Latin, they affirmed Gregorian chant, but at the same time, they said something about, I think it's actually the other way around, and I think we have to get it the other way around if we're going to promote Latin chant appropriately. He says that the 1967 Roman document Musicam Sacram has 2 revolutionary ideas, and he critiques this. The first revolutionary idea that he doesn't like is providing, listen to this, a non-musical measure for the propriety of a given musical selection for the liturgy. So the problem is that it's a non-musical measure being used to evaluate music. Yes, the criteria is non-musical. The criteria is theological. It has to do with our participation in the saving mysteries that we had in the quote from Tim O'Malley at the beginning. Further, this is his second critique, we see for the first time a blanket reference to the people's active participation as the standard against which liturgical music would be evaluated. Yes, that is true. Now, the choir can sing lots of Latin chant, but not because it's good music, but because it connects up with the people's active participation. So the starting point really does have to be those kinds of principles. So he complains that these things were advanced without due regard for extant models from the tradition. Correct. The extant models have been moved beyond. So tradition is brought forward, but the model is now a different, and I would say more, Catholic model. Fifth, the author claims that, like the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, the instruction Musicum Sacram emphasizes, he claims, the objective value of the Latin liturgical tradition and its music. The objective value. I think objective is the wrong word here for music. And the contrast here is not with objective versus subjective. So now it should be subjective. That's not what I would say. Do you know what I would contrast it with? So he's saying there's this objective value to the traditional music. I would say, no, it's not objective, it's relative to the gospel, to our salvation in Christ, to the mysteries celebrated in the liturgy. And we may well use lots of traditional music, but always relative to and subordinate to the higher end. So I summarize that musical traditionalism is an attempt to make music meaningful, but I think it is misguided. I think it's escapist, I think it's unfaithful to Vatican II, and I think it is overly epiphenomenological in a way that's not the way to connect up liturgy with life in today's culture. Maybe in the Q&A I can say more about that, or hermeneutic of continuity if you want to talk about that. So my read of these, there's a couple quotes in the Liturgy Constitution that get quoted over and over and over in the blog, on the blogosphere. Some websites, you would get the impression that the Liturgy Constitution said about 5 things. It affirmed Latin in Article 36. It affirmed the people knowing Latin in Article 54. It affirmed in Article 22 that no one, not even a priest, may change any part of the liturgy on its own initiative. And it affirmed Gregorian chant in Article 116. But it said quite a bit more than that, obviously. In my read, the foundation of the Liturgy Constitution is fundamentally a paradigm shift. Fundamentally a paradigm shift. And this is where the hermeneutic of continuity is not helpful. There are continuities, of course. There's still bread, there's still wine, there's still a Bible, there's still a priest, there's still a congregation, there's still liturgy of the word, and then liturgy of the Eucharist. There's just tons of continuity. But the hermeneutic of continuity, not so much in Pope Benedict, although I think there's a problem even in how he phrased it, but especially in the hands of his followers, it has become a way really to misread the Second Vatican Council. I think we have to say that. There are people misreading the hermeneutic of continuity, missing that there's a paradigm shift away from what was what I've called a Carolingian clericalized sacred drama. And it's really a new model we have now of a liturgy as an act of the entire congregation. So I think the most we can say about those few passages that I cited, which are in the Liturgy Constitution, they did affirm Latin chant, and they did affirm pipe organs, and they did all of that. I think we can maybe have a preferential option for tradition. I think we can speak of that, but I don't think that's our starting point. I think our starting point is the Catholic values of the Liturgy Constitution, this now more Catholic notion of the liturgy. We start with that, and then as we make our selections and make our decisions, we have kind of a preferential option. We're looking here to see does some of that fit into this new and I would say more Catholic paradigm. But I want to make it clear that this preferential option for tradition, that comes from me. That's not in the Liturgy Constitution. It's my attempt to make sense of it. Teachers have to be careful about that. Sometimes undergrads in the final exam will say, well, Jesus strongly believed in active participation in the liturgy. I'm sure he's in favor of it, but no, that's not from Jesus. So this is from AWR. So I think we need a hybrid hermeneutic for the interpretation of chapter 6 of Sacrosanctum Concilium. We need a theologically dynamic and culturally sensitive rite for theological reasons. The rite is a living dynamic alive in this cultural milieu, but we have the solid musical tradition. And do you see how those are two apples and oranges things? It's not this stable principle and this stable principle, and how do you balance the two? It's not that. It's not this dynamic force and this dynamic force, and how do we balance them? You need some kind of a hybrid that's always going to have some incoherence to it because of the incoherence found in the Liturgy Constitution, where it's primarily this dynamic thing here, but this music over here is just this stable canon, even though I know canons are living and growing and dynamic in their own way. But still, I think you see why it's challenging and problematic. Okay, in my last section, I want to talk about music making as embodied spirituality. So I want to talk about how the practice of liturgical music can be meaningful in those 5 ways that Cook and Macy talk about. I think the liturgy divinizes us, that sounds Balthasarian, by humanizing us, that sounds Rainerian. Let me say it again, the liturgy divinizes us by humanizing us. You know, Irenaeus, the glory of God is in a human person fully alive. So liturgy is not a place where we escape from the human world and stop being human so that we can be more pious and more religious and more churchy. As Aidan Kavanaugh argued in his Magnum Opus on liturgical theology, the liturgy is the real world at its most real, at its best, at its most redeemed state, but it's more real and not less real. So what I want to do here is talk about a way of making music, and this can be anything from, praise and worship to David Huss, to Richard Prue, to, music of other non-European cultures. I own and claim the culture I come from, the limitations of it. Whether we're singing, whether it's Palestrina or Latin chant or whatever, I think the great tradition of the church saw music making as something very real and very human in a way that I wish to claim today got distorted in the 18th and 19th century with the rise of this new odd thing called a concert, and the idea that you would sit for an hour and a half and hear music all ripped out of its context. It was written for a king's banquet, it was written for a royal occasion, it was written for all kinds of functional reasons. We're going to rip it all out, and we're going to put it in this sonic museum called a concert hall. And we're going to develop this notion of a great canon of classical music, and we're going to start retrieving traditional music. I think you've all heard, it's so shocking that, the music of Bach died with the death of Bach, and then Mendelssohn had to revive it in the 19th century. No coincidence that Mendelssohn, has a German last name. It's said that the Germans in the 19th century invented history as a discipline. 19th century Romanticism really developed the idea that there's this great music of the past, and a cultured, educated person would know all about Renaissance and Baroque and classical and all of the rest, and would pay to hear an hour and a half of great masterpieces. I want to not so much reject all of concert culture. I go to concerts, you know. I don't want to reject the whole, you know, music conservatory that also arose, but I do want to get behind it and say that I think there is something more human and more natural that precedes it. So I think that the monks that sang Latin chant in your Carolingian monastery, I think they had a more direct and more immediate relationship to the Latin chant. And I could say a lot about this, but I'll just make one point to make the point. For 1,500 years, music in the liturgy was sung mostly without anything written on the page. Now, they started to notate chant in the 9th or 10th century, but that was just sort of a reference so that the conductor could look at a reference book in the library before the rehearsal. But right up until the late Middle Ages, most music, most of the time, was sung without anything written on the page. Now, just think about that. How would you relate to the texts you're singing? How would you relate to the people around you? How would you relate to the assembly, to the conductor, to your own body? Radically different. What entered in is an idea that music is what's on the page. And the claim that I want to make is that so much of our music making is seeing music as what's on the page and how can I sort of do what the page is telling me to do. And I think so much of our music making is not human and real and realistic and, you know, rhythmic and all of that in a way that I believe it was in the Carolingian monastery. And, you know, the polyphony, they improvised polyphony. I don't know how they did it, but they improvised polyphony, choral harmony in the late Middle Ages, and they did it without notation. So I want to say some things about our becoming more human, more comfortable with our bodies. Hello? Did I just turn this off?
Yes.
Help! Thank you. My worst moment teaching is when the screen went blank, so I was, you know, going like this, and nothing happened, or nothing happened. I said, Father, I think you're jiggling the box of chalk. So I'm not Mr. Technology by any means. Okay, so I want to make some comments about all of this. Basically, I want to say everything that Kim Belcher said last night about dance. I think there is an embodied quality that I think we need to retrieve. So I think we need more comfort with our God-given bodies and voices. You know, in Minnesota, we have this Platonic type known as the Norwegian bachelor farmer. Have you heard about this? And how can you tell when a Norwegian bachelor farmer is an extrovert? He looks at your shoes when he talks to you. You know, I resemble this comment. You know, we're all Norwegian bachelor farmers at some level in Minnesota. Just, you know, I think we can learn from other cultures and all of this. And again, by doing so, I think we would be becoming actually more Catholic, more human, more medieval. I believe that they had this before the Enlightenment and before the rise of concert cultures and conservatories and printed music. We're going to skip that. I think we need greater relationality in our ensemble music making. And I'm looking at the clock here, so I'm going to go fairly quickly here. But I've learned from, actually that last slide, is this voice care network that Axel Timer and others run at St. John's University every summer. It's a whole approach to music making that talks about the physiology and the psychology of the human person. And I've gone through this, and it has really transformed my work with the chant schola. Insights like, If you shame a singer in a rehearsal, if you critique someone, if you say you're flat, if you say tenors, you're off pitch, that sets off a physiological reaction that affects our hormones and everything else. It takes 20 to 30 minutes before the body rediscovers its natural equilibrium. The muscles will be tighter, and it affects the intonation and everything else. So it's really wonderful. And, Axel Timer is, from Vienna, and his music selection with the choir, I would say, is, it's overly Eurocentric and all of that. But his approach to it has been transformed by the Voice Care Network about music making is about a positive relationality. I mean, it's to the point where he gets great results, but he won't even say to singers, quiet, like when he worked with the National Catholic Youth Choir. If I tell them, be quiet and listen, they're not going to sing well for 20 minutes. So, it's come to this, a resort to things like I'll make a joke when some students are talking over here, and there's a lot of laughter here, and then as the laughter dies down, I then go on, and I got their attention without shaming anyone. Isn't that interesting? It's kind of a hassle. I would have liked it better. When I got to say, like my parents did back in the farm where I grew up, I'm the boss, be quiet. Because I said so. Did your parents ever say that? That was the reason for a lot of things, because I said so. But I think that kind of authoritarianism no longer works. So relationality, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I think we need naturalness in proclamation of text. Gregorian chant arose because people had texts in their heart, they spoke Latin, and they wanted to express it. You put your texts on a page, you put the page in front of the singer, and the singer sings, "Oh God, you are my God, for you I want." And so the formula is getting the better of me, and I'm trying to figure out the pointing and all of that. It's wonderful for me to see how naturally this group can sing the psalm tones, like a whole culture of singing psalm tones. We've all heard cantors do it. It has now really taken root in the church. I think that's a great thing. But I think we really have to work with our cantors to become more naturally human about, think about the text that was being sung for centuries before it ever got written on the page. Comfort with rhythm and dance. And so much Baroque music is dance music. Do we all know this? Dun, 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 dun. Gelobt sei Gott sounds so German. That's the name of that hymn tune. It's a dance. So we need a whole way of playing the organ that really brings out the dance character of so many of our traditional hymns. And I think we need relationality and engagement of the assembly. Have you ever seen a cantor do this? I sing my whole psalm, and then when it's your turn to sing, I do this. We work with the National Catholic Youth Choir choristers about, just relate to the people first. Don't let that odd thing of written music get in the way of the basic relationality. But I want to clarify in everything that I've said about making our music more human, retrieving a meaningful way of making music, I fear that some of you may have heard me say that we don't need a lot of professionalism, and we don't need to take a lot of organ lessons now. We just need to be, prayerful. I have to clarify, I'm not saying that. I think we need more professionalism, but of a certain kind, redirected to a certain end. So I am not saying that, when you're picking your piano player, go for the one who has the deepest faith. I'm all in favor of deep faith, but, hire the one who can play the right notes with a good dance rhythm. And they, may not be, as Catholic or as believing or whatever. Music is a good thing, and musical skills are a good thing, but I think we need a type of musical training in the church that I'm not sure is taught in our music conservatories or in our music universities. So I'm trying to think of an example here. Liturgical music, like all music, it has a downbeat to it and a swing to it, not Gregorian chant, but the metered music. And that downbeat is so solid, but it's not rigid. This is very important for engaging the assembly. There's a little bit of what's called rubato, robbing a bit of time, and then picking it up again. To be able to do this, your piano player has to be able to look at the cantor, and we all have to feel the rhythm together. Here's the point. To do that, you have to be a better piano player who is more able to memorize your music so that you can look up. It takes greater skills. Knowing more music theory to know the chords and the structures of it will make you more able to be really human in making music. Does that make sense to you? So we absolutely need more musical skills, but skills of a particular kind. So we need organists who can learn the skill of how to breathe with a congregation, how to feel the rubato, and how to pick up the downbeats. I want to conclude there. I fear that I've used up most all of my time. So my conclusion now will be that was my talk. So thank you. I hope I have given you something to think about in the discussion this afternoon. And I don't know, do we have time?
We have some time for questions or comments.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask you about Messiaen, the composer, and the avant-garde. And this might be kind of just off the whim, but I just wanted to ask if, I guess his avant-garde compositions weren't necessarily used in liturgy, but his faith and Thomism really, was infused with everything that he did in the avant-garde, and he's probably one of the father of 20th century composers. So I just didn't know if you had anything to say about the avant-garde in liturgy, if you ever see there's a place for that at all in any part of the liturgy.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I hope so. I think there's a tragedy to Messiaen's conflicted relationship to the liturgy. I think he did not inwardly accept the reforms of the liturgy. And that's, for me, is a tragedy because he's such a great composer. As you perhaps might have intuited, I do want a relationship between the church and culture. And I don't want a Balthasarian sectarianism where we condemn everything that's out there. You can find, there was an article in First Thing saying Western music with Stravinsky's Rite of Spring became, non-Christian and post-Christian. No, I don't think we can say that. So I think we have to strategically try to find points of overlap where this music can work in the liturgy. I think there aren't a lot of them, but there are some. So I would hope there is a place for the avant-garde. In the same way, I think there has to be a place, you have to be careful with this, but a place for jazz and a place for evangelical and all of that. It's not necessarily what I want. My tastes are dull. You probably guessed that. But on theological grounds, I do think we need interaction with the culture at the level of high art or at the level of more, commercial pop culture.
Father Anthony, thank you. I especially appreciated your outline of a Rainerian approach to liturgical music and the liturgy in the comparison with the Balthasarian. I'm a sacred musician, and I had a thought I wanted to share with you and see what you thought. It seems to me the point at which the Balthasarian and Rainerian meet is in the notion of conversion. Because if we think of Revelation and the person of Christ as beauty, something that makes a claim on us and stuns us, I'm not speaking for Balthasar here, but from my theological background, I know there's the idea that beauty makes us want to be one with it. It makes us want to become it. And the prerequisite for this, I guess we could also call this divinization, is a death to self, also conversion. Something I've that has troubled me when I've been in parish situations, and the emphasis is over and over again, people like this, stick with what people will speak to people, don't ruffle any feathers, we don't want to cause trouble, is that there becomes a sort of complacency that gets further and further away from this notion of conversion, of the sense that liturgical music, because it flows from the Eucharist, from the liturgy, like you said, asks us to become divinized. It asks us to become beauty, to, in a sense, leave our comfort zone behind. So I'm curious what you think of this, and as sacred musicians, how do we be wary of this complacency? And when is the right time to push, to push people outside their comfort zone?
Well, thank you. That's excellent. I think, I agree with you. And what this tells me is that we shouldn't really oppose Rahner and von Balthasar to each other and pick sides. I believe it will be a paradox from now until the end of time. And I think a watered down Rahner doesn't work too well. And I see that sometimes, in the NCR, I think you know which one I mean, where all experience is fine just the way it is. So you start from below, but it seems like you stay there. So I agree with that. Maybe in my talk, I'm coming at it from the other way because I'm seeing the dangers of this Balthasarianism becoming, and I don't mean you, I certainly mean parts of my own life, but it can become too much of an agenda, and it can become, and I know you don't mean this, and I suspect you and I would probably make similar judgments in elevating the music, and I certainly do believe in all of that. If that's what we're talking about, that's great, and I do think strategically and downright politically about how to have more traditional hymnody and more Latin chant and all of that, and that would be Balthasarian, and I'm actually probably about half-half. I'm reacting against an agenda that is pastorally harmful and divisive, and I'm too confident of my stuff, and I've never asked the question of whether my agenda is Eurocentric. And I only think that people's experience doesn't count because my music is true. And I'm sure you don't mean that by it. I could tell by the nice nuance with the way you framed the question. So I think it is a both and I hope your question helped me to clarify that, because I'm really coming from one side, and that's not the whole side.
I was wondering if you could speak to parishes that say they have 4 masses on a weekend and each one features a different styling of music. You talked a lot about, wanting to kind of avoid, almost a sectarianness. And I mean, parishes, you could argue that there's 4 different parishes on a weekend because these people go to this mass because they prefer this kind of music, etc. What would be your advice to liturgy planners, music planners, pastors?
Yeah, this question is oftentimes asked, and I think most liturgical types would say, and I'm guessing most of the room would say, that's a problem. That's a problem. We're one parish, we're one community. I am less absolutist about that, however. So I would say, let's work for unity. The Mass of Creation was a nice way to bridge things. So I would hope there would be, English chant of the Missal that's being used at all the Masses. I would hope that even a little bit of Latin chant can be done at your so-called contemporary Mass. I would hope that some traditional hymns, some of the Protestant megachurches are using traditional Protestant hymns in kind of a jazzed up way. I think that's a good thing. So I think we should think about how to do all of that. At the same time, throughout the history of the church, the liturgy was not identical everywhere. So in your medieval town, there was a Franciscan and a Benedictine and a Trappist option, and there was the cathedral and there was the parish. And there always have been different pieties, and in our own history in this country, there were ethnic parishes. So I don't think it's absolutely evil, but I think we should work toward more commonality and find, clever strategic ways to do that.
The last question.
Thank you for the presentation, very stimulating, thought-provoking. I was wondering if you could speak just briefly about multicultural liturgies, perhaps at a diocesan setting or even at a parish setting that might be multicultural. And within that, for instance, the use of other instruments besides the traditional piano or organ. Sometimes guitars, for instance, are viewed as not an adequate instrument, but that would be the instrument in many cultures, particularly in the Hispanic, perhaps Filipino culture. And so if you could just address that a little bit, how we could maybe expand our imagination of liturgical music.
Yes, this is very important, and I didn't even talk about it, so I just have to say, my approach to music, I come from my narrow cultural background, and it's all Eurocentric, and I don't mind saying that's who I am, that's what I come from, and that's what I love. Theologically, though, I don't believe that God is a white European. I just don't believe that. And here again, it's this problem with culture being ignored. People promote Latin chant without any awareness that it came from a cultural context. So I would say that there's all kinds of music that's not my culture and doesn't speak to me. I believe very strongly, though, that it's theologically legitimate. And I think this is going to be one of these paradoxes we can't solve. Is the treasury of sacred music multicultural? No, it's not. I think we just have to admit that. We have to say, is there something about Palestrina that transcends cultures? Sometimes it does. I mean, the treasury is doing very well in Asia. It's doing better there than it is, in the Midwest where I come from. But we have to ask, is this traditional music meaningful in other cultural contexts? If it is, okay. If not, okay. But I would say very strongly that we cannot assert that this culture is better or normative in any way, shape, or form. Theologically, I think we have to be, absolutely pluralistic. So I think this is a tension within the Liturgy Constitution. And of course, Articles 37 to 40 are very strong on this point. And I think you really can't cultivate the treasury without looking at Articles 37 to 40. And then the Constitution on the Church in the modern world. Even when it's not talking about music at all, it really is, because it talks about this openness to all cultures, which I totally affirm. So I thank you for reminding us of that.
Let's thank Father Ruff.